Hi everybody, Dave back again here, and today, and actually over the next few days, but you'll just see it in maybe an hour or so, I'm going to be building the Vapor rocket by Estes, and this is a mid-power rocket, runs on D&E engines, and this is definitely not one you want to do as one of your first rockets, but as you've gained a little bit of experience and you improve your techniques, this is a nice, fourth or fifth rocket perhaps. So as we usually do on these videos, we'll go through the contents of the package, make sure we have everything, and then get into the build. Alright, so checking out our parts list here, we'll start with the fin stock, and this is going to have very long, narrow fins. This will be the actual root edge of the fin here. Okay, we have two body tubes, an upper and a lower here, and this will give us a very long rocket at the end. Alright, we've got a nose cone, a tube coupler, which will join our two body tubes, a set of centering rings, and this will center the engine mount within the body tubes, which means we also need an engine mount. And this might be stuck up inside the engine mount. This is a spacer that will be used to position the engine block within this. This won't actually be part of the rocket, but if you go to look for it, in my case it was in the package. Okay, we have a parachute, a fairly long elastic shock cord. And then we have this little package that contains an engine spacer. That's this red thing here. This will be used when we're flying this with a D engine rather than an E. We've got a 3/8 inch Launch Lug, and this is the engine block, and then this plastic two-piece assembly is the engine retainer. And if you're used to building smaller rockets that tend to have just a wire clip retainer, this will actually screw on and off to hold the engine in, and it gives kind of a more professional look to it. One last thing is there is this sheet of water slide decals, and they actually have two motifs here, and this is what was shown on the package of this rocket. Is you can decorate this using one motif or the other, or there's nothing wrong with using both or mix and match. That'll be up to you. So we have a pretty hefty set of instructions here, and we're actually going to skip ahead to begin with. So normally it shows here getting ready to set up the engine mount, mark the tube for the fins and such. I'm actually going to skip ahead here to begin with to the preparation of the fins. And the reason for this is because I'm going to use some sanding sealer to help seal up the grain of the fins and give a smoother finish, but it takes several hours for that to dry. So I'll start with this first, and then we can continue with the rest of the build while the fins are drying. Okay, so these are already laser cut, and they'll just have some little tiny tabs in here that are holding them on. And you can do a couple of things here. Some modelers like to sand the whole sheet before they even take them out, and that's good for the initial sanding at least. And then once we get them cut out, we'll go ahead and sand them again to give them some shape. So these fins are made of balsa, which is a very soft wood, so when I go to sand them here, I'm going to use fine sandpaper. Some people like to use more of a medium grit, but it doesn't take a whole lot to really start to wear this down, and so you can get a little over sanded sometimes by using coarser grits. Okay, and this is just an aluminum extrusion that I've got sandpaper on. This is actually kind of a handy design that Apogee makes, but if you don't have one, just a small block of wood is fine on this. I'm just going to go ahead and do both sides here. course, we always want to sand with the grain. And you notice this fin's already trying to come out, so they're not put in there very heavily here. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and just use my hobby knife to remove the last little remnants of the attachments. You do want to be careful that you're only cutting through the attachment points there and not into the fins themselves. And of course has something protective down underneath this. Alright, so there's one fin, and these are fairly thick fins to go with the heavier nature of the rocket. And as you do more and more rocketry, you're probably going to have waste pieces of balsa like this. I just keep these in a box so that if I need to make a repair, or there's even enough balsa here to make probably a whole nother set of fins for a smaller rocket. So one of the things we do tend to accumulate is scrap wood. I'm going to set that aside. Alright, and when we come back here, I'm going to show how, at least one way, to seal these fins, which will make them smoother. It'll also strengthen them a little bit. There is more than one way to do this, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But I'm going to go ahead and clean up my sawdust mess here and then put down a little bit of protective paper, because the sealer I use is actually a polyurethane base. Okay, so there are lots of different ways to seal the wood here. I like this. This is a urethane-based sanding sealer. And according to the can, it dries in 2 hours. I like to leave it a little bit longer than that. There are also some water-based ones as well. And you can actually do this without sealing the fins at all. It just means you're going to have to spend more time sanding and priming it when we get to the finishing stage if you want to have that nice smooth appearance on the fins. Okay. This stuff you can find in just about any hardware or paint store. It's normally used to prevent stain from soaking too far into wood when you're doing woodworking. I'm going to go ahead and put on some disposable gloves here, because I do this in kind of an unorthodox fashion. Instead of using a paintbrush or something, I'm just going to dip the fins in this. If you happen to have a smaller can, that doesn't work quite as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, I've got some little tiny dowels here. They're actually the shafts from cotton applicators like this. And I can use these to hold my fins while they're drying. Now, I have not done anything else to these other than the sanding that we just did. Eventually, you want to sand the edges here to get these rough spots off. According to the instructions, they suggest rounding the leading edges here to give it some partial streamlining. Oops, that's actually the base edge. This would be the leading edge. They don't actually tell you to round or give a knife edge to this for the airfoil. You can. I suspect the reason they don't actually show airfoiling this back edge here is to give it some additional strength. There's that trade-off. You can sand a really nice airfoil into all this, but that does weaken the wood a little bit on the edges. And quite often in my own rockets, if they hit a little hard, it's always that knife edge part of the fin that tends to chip or break. So you can do that if you want, but I'm not going to do it until after the first coat here. So now I'm just dipping this in. And this is the reason I'm wearing gloves, because I'm going to have to grab the other end here. I'm going to dip this other side in. And quite likely I'm going to have to use 2 coats to get the smooth finish that I want. But now what I'm doing here is just taking one of these little dowels and using it to squeegee off the excess here. And this does get messy, so make sure you've got protection for your work surface here. Okay, so looks like I can do a little more squeegeeing here. And after this dries, then I will sand it again to remove any high spots where the finish may, or the sanding sealer may have dried into a ridge or something like that, or a little blob there. Try and get all little blobs off. Alright, that's now what I've got my little dowels here, is I can set the fin on top of this so that the air can circulate around. We might get a little ridge where they're touching the dowels there, but that can be sanded away. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing to the other 3 fins. I really don't think you want to watch me doing it for all this time. So when we come back here, then we'll come back to the beginning of the instructions and look at the assembly of the motor mount and the body tubes. So I've set aside my fins, and they're going to dry. And in the meantime, then, we can come back to the start of our instructions and look at assembling the engine mount. For this part, you're going to need either some white glue or some wood glue. Either one is fine. I've talked about the advantages and disadvantages of both of these. For this, I'm actually going to use the wood glue just because it sets up a little bit quicker. And then I would recommend having a Q-tip or some other type of applicator that will help you get glue up into harder places to reach. Okay, you may also need a little bit of sanding paper, and of course your hobby knife, and you'll need a ruler. So the first thing we're going to do is mark our tube. And remember, it's the white tube that is the actual motor mount. The yellow tube here is a spacer. Okay, so from this end, all right, it's showing a 1/2 inch or a 13 millimeter mark. Okay, I'm a scientist, so I tend to work in metric most of the time anyway. So there's 13 millimeters. And then we need another at about 2 inches or just over 5 centimeters from the end. So 5.1 is right there. Okay, and then on our spacer here, we need a mark at 10 millimeters from one end, or 3/8 of an inch. Okay. Now the engine block was in that little package that included the engine spacer and the engine mount retainer. And so what we're going to do here is this is going to fit inside of this up near the end here. And so what we'll do, right now I don't have any glue or anything, is that this will slide in, and then the spacer tube here, we'll want to hold on to the marked end, and then that's going to go in until we reach that mark. And we'll come back out again. And that will leave the engine block up inside the tube there. Okay, so it's a good idea to know approximately where that's going to be, so that in this next step, when we actually put some glue in there, you won't be gluing the whole tube, or you won't miss there. And so I'm just going to back that out a little bit. I'm going to leave the engine block in there. I'm just going to back it down a little. And now I'm going to take my wood glue here. I'm just going to pop the top off of this and use my applicator here to get up inside there. So now I'm going to go ahead and put this actually right about where, I don't know if you can see that in the video here. I'm just going to put a ring of glue. Oh, spacer fell down, but that's okay. It's not the spacer, the engine block. And I want to make sure that it goes all the way around, because this is going to feel the full thrust of our motor And when we're up in D and E motors, the thrust is getting usually about twice as much as what we would find in, say, a C6 or B6. Okay, so now I'm going to take my motor spacer again once more. Okay, and insert that in just to the line, and now I'm going to pull it back out again. And you might, I don't know if you can see that in the video or not, there's just a little hint of glue on the end of that, which is why you don't want to leave that in for very long. Alright, if we look at the end now, okay, you can see the engine block there. It's got a really nice bead of glue butted up against it there. There's a little bit inside, but it looks like a pretty thin film, and I don't think that's going to be a problem. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry for a while. And that means we don't want to go on to the next part here right away. So the first thing we need to do is cut out the rings here. And just like the fins, these are laser cut, and you just have to remove a little bit of attaching paper there. And then I would take a small piece of sandpaper like I've got here and just use that to sand out any of the remaining nubs there. So I'm going to do that. Okay, and then what I'm going to do here is just take my sandpaper and just lightly sand off those nubs. And you can see a little bit of the charring here that's left from the laser cutting. You can give that just a really light touch of the sandpaper. And the reason I do this is it just makes for a better gluing surface. Okay, and then the same thing for the inside. And here you can use that engine spacer again and wrap your sandpaper around that, and then just slide that through. You have to adjust the size of your sandpaper. There we go. Alright, and I'm just going to give this a couple of turns inside this, and that'll be enough to clear that. Okay, I'm going to do this with the other three rings, and when we come back we will mount them to the engine holder. It's been a couple hours now, and the glue inside the engine mount here around the engine block is pretty much dried. Certainly safe to work with now. And I've also finished breaking out and sanding the engine centering rings. And I have left behind the inserts that were in the middle of these. I'm going to hang on to these. I'm not going to use them for this kit, but these are actually a good size for making bulkheads in a smaller body tube rocket. So these are going to go into my junk parts box along with the excess balsa that we had from the fins. Okay, so what we do now is we're simply going to glue on these rings where our markings were, and I'm just going to dry fit these here quickly. And the last one just goes right at the end here. You want to leave just enough space there where we're going to add in a glue fillet. But that's roughly the way these are positioned, and then these will fit inside the body tube. This is another point that's going to require a lot of glue drying time, so I'm going to go ahead and put this on, and then we'll let this dry while we go on to the next part. So I'm going to get my glue here again, and actually for this one I'm going to use the white glue because it gives a little bit more control just with the glue bottle here. So I'm going to pull these off, and now I'm just going to run a bead of glue around where these are going to go on. Okay, so there's one. You can do two of these at once. The third one will have to wait till I get the rings on. Okay. And these don't have to be really precise except for this end one here. So you can just see, I can just see the pencil mark there. So I'm going to just run that on to where it goes. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a turn, and that will just kind of even out the glue here. And now I just want to make sure that the ring is on straight. Now the reason I say this one needs to be really precise is because the engine retainer, that gray piece that we looked at earlier, has to have enough clearance here to be glued on properly to hold the engine in place in the right spot. Okay, but this other one, the middle one here, if you're off a few millimeters in either direction, it's not going to hurt anything. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing here. Put it on, and I'm just going to rotate it a little bit, and this just gives a nice even distribution of the glue. In fact, it makes us a really nice fillet there, which will be the next step anyway. Okay, and if these are just a little bit crooked, it really doesn't matter. It won't be enough to really change the way the rocket flies or anything. You know, if they're really crooked, it might. But if you're just off a little bit, that's okay. And I found my pencil mark here. I'm just going to rotate up a little bit and get back on there. Okay, and then for the last one, I'm just going to run a bead just inside the edge. And a good glue job is really important here because this is the part of the rocket that transfers the thrust to the body of the rocket. So with the motor inside there, its thrust is getting transferred mainly to that engine block ring, which transfers it to this entire assembly, and these rings transfer it to the body of the rocket itself. So we don't want any weak spots on here. If you have a weak point, that could result in a structural failure and the engine tries to travel up through the body tube, and that's generally not a good thing to have happen. Alright, and now what I'm going to do is just run a bead of glue around the side of the ring that didn't have the glue on it to make a new fillet here. You can just take your finger and come around just to smooth it all in. Looks like I'm going to need to add a little more glue. Again, this is a major structural point here, and we don't want it to give way at any point. Okay, and I'm just going to once again check for straightness. Okay, and then do the same thing down here. Now when this is all done, I'm going to let it dry standing upright on its end so that the glue does not run down in one direction or another. Especially with white glue, since it has a longer working time, it tends to be a bit runnier. Okay, so there I've got fillets there, and then I need to do this side. Be a little bit careful with this. You don't want to get the glue too far up the tube. Otherwise we won't have room for the engine retainer to be glued in place. Usually that's not a problem here, but just be aware of it. Okay, so now, and once again, I'm just going to make sure everything's at least mostly straight. Okay, and I'm going to set this aside, and our next job will be to mark the body tubes for the fin placement and the launch lugs. For the next step, we need to cut out this guide here, and the only thing that's on the reverse side of this is the picture of the rocket itself and all the supplies listed there. So most likely you don't need it, but if you want to keep your instructions intact, just make a photocopy of this and that'll work fine. So we're just going to cut this out quickly. And we need to take one of the body tubes. It doesn't matter which one, as they're identical at this point. I'm just going to mark on this down here that this is the aft end, so we don't have any confusion later on and end up with the fins halfway up the rocket. Okay, so all we have to do on this is wrap it around and then overlap the cross-hatched region. Okay, so we need to line up the two lines there, and then you can just tack this in place with some masking tape. There we go. Okay, so we're going to have 3 fin lines and a launch lug line. And I'm just going to scoot this up a little bit so that I can mark on both ends. Okay, so I'm just going to mark here, here, here. Okay, where the tape is, there is no mark. It just kind of looks like there should be. And one here. And for the launch lug, I'm actually going to mark just a small LL here. So I don't accidentally put a fin in that place. And I'm going to go ahead and mark on the other sides as well. Okay, and then we can just slide this off. Now in the instructions it shows using a door jamb or door frame here to then extend these lines down. I don't have a handy door frame where I am shooting this video, but Estes makes this nice little thing here. This is a tube marker, and basically it just gives you a whole bunch of straight lines at different depths for different types of body tubes. Okay, so I'm just going to set mine up here. That's the wrong one. So you just got to kind of flip this around until you find the right edge that you need. Let's see, I think I need this one actually. Okay, so you don't need to go out and buy one of these just to make this rocket. Door jambs usually work well. You can also use a piece of angle aluminum, kind of like the extrusion on this. So I could use one side of this actually. Or you can get just a right angle extrusion at hardware stores. Again, you don't need to run out and get one now, but if you're going to do a lot of rocketry, they do come in handy. Okay, so my launch lug line here needs to be fairly long, because the launch lug is actually going to come up here somewhere. So I'm just going to make a really long line here. I'm just going to extend it up the whole length of the body tube, because I don't remember right off the top of my head where the launch lug is going to end up, but it's usually up here somewhere. All right, and then my fin markings here. I want to make these just a little bit longer than what the fins are. Okay, and so you can actually just take one of the fins and say, all right, I need to get my line up to about there. You just want the line to go a little bit beyond the fins so that you can still see it when you glue the fins on. Okay, and so we have another line here. Okay, so now we should have 3 fin lines and 1 launch lug line here. Okay, and you don't need to make these very dark, you just need to be able to see them, because actually anything that remains when you're done mounting the fins you'll want to erase anyway. Now while we're letting the glue dry on the motor mount, I just wanted to show you this fin. This has got its first coat of sanding sealer on it, and you can see it's kind of darkened it a little bit. That's okay, as we're going to paint it anyway. And there's a little bit of shiny spots here. That's where it was a little bit thicker, and it has not quite dried completely yet. But when this has dried, I'm going to go ahead and sand the whole surface again. And at that point, I will round out the leading edge. Oops, I keep doing the wrong one. Round out the leading edge here. And I'm going to leave it just the same way it shows in the instructions. I'm not going to try and taper or put an airfoil edge on the back here. On the root edge, where it's going to be glued, it's a good idea to sand this so that you get through the layer of the sanding sealer. We actually want the porous wood to make a better glue joint, especially since these are just going to be glued to the outside of the body tube. I was actually a little bit surprised and disappointed that this did not have what are called through-the-wall fins, where you actually have a slot in the body tube and a tab on the fin, and that you actually glue it through onto the motor mount. This makes a much stronger fin, and actually it makes it easier to get your fins on straight. And most, I don't know about most, but a good number of mid-power rocket kits have been going to this, where they just assume that you're going to have through-the-wall fin mounts, and it does, like I said, it makes a much stronger rocket, and really doesn't cost that much more to make in a kit. Oh well, Estes had their reasons, I guess. So we'll come back here in a little bit after the fins are dry and the glue is dry and everything else is dry, and we'll start putting this all back together. Alright, we're still waiting for the fins and the motor mount to dry. And what I've done here is pretty much skipped along to the end of the instructions, which will include mounting the nose cone on here. First thing is just check it for flash. I actually had a little piece here that was in this eyelet, and it just fell off when I picked it up, so that wasn't too hard to remove. But there's usually a seam along this, and we can take some fine sandpaper, I'm using 220 grit, and just sand that down. There's usually kind of a ridge and a little bit of a groove there, and this will take the ridge down. The groove is a little bit harder, and we can fill that in with primer as we prepare to paint the tube, or excuse me, paint the nose cone. Okay, so there's going to be one on each side. And then once you've got that where it's as smooth as you can get it, and sometimes you can knock down enough of the plastic there that you'll actually meet that groove, which is great if you can, but don't sand it so much that you weaken the nose cone. But once you've got both of those grooves taken care of, and there's a little bit of flash up here on the tip, then go ahead and just lightly sand the rest of the nose cone here. That'll first of all give you a uniform finish, and the light sanding actually also makes it easier for the paint to stick. So I'm just going to give this light sanding all the way around. And of course this is getting really boring watching somebody sand a nose cone, so I'm just going to end the video at this point. I'm going to do a little bit more sanding off the video, but that's pretty much all we need to do there. You can test fit this with the upper body tube if you like. We're not going to do anything with it quite yet, but this will just give you a kind of a preview. And I can notice right now that is really smooth and loose there. In fact, if I just give this a little bit of a wiggle, it'll come off. Which is going to tell me that most likely by the time we get to the finished product here, I'm going to have to put a little bit of masking tape along the shoulder of this. And that's not uncommon. Okay. Now if this were really, really tight, we might need to sand off some of these little, these are actually little bars for inducing friction. You might have to sand some of those down. But I would wait on that until you're actually finished with a rocket before you do any more sanding on here. Because some of the things that you may do, including painting, maybe if you get a little paint on the inside of the tube here or a little paint on the shoulder, that's going to change the way it fits as well. So don't get too carried away. Just sand down the nose cone, proper here so that it's ready to be painted. But it's just a little bit something more you can do while you're waiting for other parts to dry. The glue on the engine mount has dried sufficiently that we can put it in. And I'm just going to look at, notice we've got just a few little gap bubbles in here along this, this would be the aft end. But everything else looks really good. The inner fillets look good. This we can actually add some to, and in fact when we put the engine retainer on, it'll fit on like this, and we're actually going to put some epoxy on here, and so the epoxy that will run down from this will actually fill in and make a new fillet over this, so I'm not too concerned about that. So we want to make sure that we're on the aft end, which is why I wrote aft on here, and we just want to dry fit this inward. And so this will be flush when it's finished. Take that back out. Now in our instructions it says to put glue up about 2 inches in, and that what will happen is then the glue will get pushed forward by the rings here. So most of the glue is going to end up on this forward ring, and we might get a thin film back in here, but it's actually the forward ring that's going to take most of the glue and therefore most of the pressure and the thrust on this. And then once it's in all the way, we'll go ahead and add a bead of glue around this. We can touch up the fillet there if we need to. And like I said, when we put the engine retainer on, we'll probably have a nice layer of epoxy in there too, and so that'll hold in the other end. So I'm going to go ahead and use wood glue for this. And I'm going to open this up and then get a applicator stick to put in there. Okay, so you can use a wood dowel, you can use a scrap piece of wood, even a stiff piece of cardboard if you don't have anything else. Okay, now here I'm going to want to get a rough idea. Probably should do this before I put that in the glue. That's okay. So 2 inches here, right, or about 5 centimeters, so that's going to be right around there. So if I put my thumb there, that's about where I want my glue to go. So now I'm just going to stick this in up to my thumb, and roll that around in there. Okay, now the rings, the centering rings are actually going to go up beyond that. So I can't get this up far enough for you to see all the way down inside it there. But now I'm just going to, now that I know where the glue needs to be, now I'm going to add a thicker layer on that. And I'm even going to put some further up in to approximately where that centering ring is going to be. And that'll give me a nice internal fillet here. Now the drawback to this, especially when you're using wood glue rather than the white, is you got basically one chance at this. So you got to get that in there, and then I'm going to press it down on its end to make it flush. Okay, and so there's our, it's going to be out of focus. There's our motor mount within there. I'm going to let this sit for just a few minutes and let that glue set up before I put in the fillet around the outside of the ring here. So when I come back, I'll have already done that, and we'll go on to mounting the fins. So if you want to keep being able to build while other parts are drying here, we can skip ahead and do the coupler here. Now, In the instructions it shows putting the coupler into the lower body tube first and then into the upper one. It doesn't really matter, and since our lower body tube is having its motor mount dry right now, we can go ahead and we'll just do it in reverse. And so we can stick this into the upper body tube, let it dry, and then we can glue it into the lower body tube when that one is ready. What we want to do here is measure our tube. Okay, so this is just over 7.5 centimeters. I suspect it's probably actually 3 inches. It is. So we're going to want to just put a little line at halfway through there. So at 1.5 inches on the non-metric scale. And that's how far we'll push it up there. So once we have the glue in place, this will go up until we hit that line. Okay, and then that can be drying. And actually, if we use the wood glue on this, it only needs to dry for a few minutes before it'll be set in place long enough to work on the other end. So once again here, I'm going to go ahead and use our wood glue. Instead of trying to squirt it through the nozzle into here, I'm just going to use essentially an extra long Q-tip with cotton applicator here. And I'm going to swab this around in here. You don't want it right up next to the edge here, as that may give too much glue, and the coupler might get stuck before it's fully inserted. Okay. And so here's again my coupler, and we're just going to slide that up. Okay, and we'll hit the glue there, and then we'll just give it a little bit of turn back and forth to make sure the glue is seated up against both sides of the tube and the coupler. And now we can just let this sit. I'm going to let it sit for just a few minutes, and then we're going to come back and put the shock cord in the other end of the tube. Now my glue in the coupler is setting up, and while that's happening, we need to cut out this shock cord mount. Oops, just lost it there. Cut out this shock cord mount. And again, if you didn't want to cut up your instructions, you could have photocopied this page. We'll just pop this out quickly. Okay. Now the instructions for this are back here. And so our shock cord is just this big long piece of 1/4 inch flat rubber. This is actually 4 feet long. It's a really good sized shock cord. And what we're going to do here is we're going to put glue over this whole thing, and then put the shock cord at a diagonal across it, and then we're going to fold each number over the other. So the 1 will fold over the 2, and then the 2 will fold over the 3. And with all the glue in there, this is going to become one giant mess of shock cord and shock cord mount and glue, which is what we want. That gives us a nice strong bond. And then this will go into the forward end of the upper tube. Now note here, this has to go in at least 1.5 inches or about 4 centimeters, and that's just to give enough clearance between the shoulder of the nose cone and the shock cord mount. If this is too far up here, then the nose cone is going to butt up against that, and it's not going to deploy properly. In general, what I like to do with this type of a mount is get it down as far as my finger can reach, because it won't hurt anything to go down a little bit farther, and it just keeps this area clear for the nose cone and the parachute and everything else, so it won't have any interference, and you're less likely to have a recovery failure. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and take my glue, and I'm using the same wood glue again. You can use white glue here as well. Okay, and I'm just going to make a nice even film here. The instructions show folding and then putting some glue and then folding and putting some glue. And you can do that. But I like just starting off with a good heavy film of glue here. There's a lot of cotton on that. Okay, and again I'm going to lay this in a diagonal, and the reason for this is so that when this part folds over, the shock cord isn't laying across itself lengthwise, which would make it a lot bumpier. Okay, so now I'm just going to fold part 1 over and onto part 2. Okay, and a little bit of glue may be oozing around here. That's actually good. Okay, and then up here I can move it a little bit toward the center. Okay, so this is actually a little bit off center. The instructions show it being completely centered. If you do it this way, it's okay. Okay, and I'm just going to squeeze the glue through here so that it's evenly distributed, because basically we want glue all throughout this. And then this side here we're going to add more glue to, and then it will be pressed up against the inside of the body tube. Okay, so I'm just going to add a little more glue here. You want a nice even coat, but not with big globs on it, because we don't want big globs coming out into the body tube. But make sure you get all of it covered there. And again, we want to get this as far down as we can, a minimum of 4 centimeters. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of slide this in a little bit on the non-glue side until I can see that it's down far enough. And then I'll flip the tube over. And so now the glue side is down. And I'm just moving that down again. And again, I'm going down as far as my finger can go. If you have short fingers, you can actually use a dowel or something to press it down as well. Okay, but now I'm just going to press this down against the inside. I'll put my hand opposite it. Okay. I'm actually going to use the handle of my hobby knife here to get the very end of it. And then I can just roll it around over the mount. And the idea is to get a good even film of glue between the shock cord mount and the inside of the body tube. Okay, so I don't think you can have enough clearance between my camera there. Nope. Alright, you'll have to take my word for it, but that's down there. Okay, and now this needs to set up completely before we do anything else with it. But that's about as much as we can do with the upper body tube here. The only thing left to do with it is to attach the nose cone and the parachute. And those will be some of the very last things we'll do. So a day has passed, and my fins here now have been thoroughly dried from the sanding sealer. And I've already gone ahead and sanded off most of these. Now if you're using the polyurethane based sealer like I did, when these first come out, they're going to be really shiny due to the polyurethane coating. And what I've done is sanded this down until only the deeper parts of the grain here still have that shininess, because that's where it's filled in. And so that's what we want. The higher parts we've sanded down, the lower parts have been filled in, and that's the whole idea behind the sanding sealer here. I've also re-sanded the root edge here that's going to go onto the rocket itself. This is where we'll glue it on. If we had too much of the sanding sealer still left on here, it would not form a good bond. I have also rounded the edges here of the leading edge. Now some people may want to give this another thin coat of sanding sealer before they put these on. I found that just priming these after it's been glued on is usually enough. But if you want a super smooth finish, you might want another coat there. Okay, so now we have our body tube. This has also been drying overnight. Our engine mount is now thoroughly glued into place. And what we're going to do now is apply the fins along the lines that we drew earlier. So they're going to go on about like this. And in the instructions here, they're not too explicit. They assume by now that you've glued on some fins before. And they do also give us this guide here so that when the fins are initially put on, you can then place the rocket up on this guide and check the placement of your fins. So they should be equidistant and nicely perpendicular to the tube. Okay, so by the instructions it kind of looks like all we're doing is just putting some glue on and sticking them directly on there. And what I want to do is actually give a little bit more time for them. And so if you've seen some of my other videos, we do this already. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to use the wood glue just because it does set up quicker. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just run a bead of glue all along the root edge here. Try and get it as even as possible. I'm getting a few little gaps here. And I can just use my finger now to even things out a bit more. And again, we don't want great big globs of glue running off, but we don't want to be too skimpy either. And now what I'm going to do is first just briefly touch this along. And my line is kind of faint, so I do want to make sure I'm getting it just in the right place. Like this. And I want to make sure they're straight. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this back off. And I'm just going to let the glue get tacky here for about 60 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and pause my video here, and when we come back we'll stick this on for real. So now it's been about a minute, and I'm just going to go ahead and put this back on. And again, the tricky part here is making sure that you're keeping this straight on the line. Okay, and then we need to make sure that it's straight on the tube, so it's sticking straight up. The very base of the root edge here should be flush with the body tube. Okay, and I'm just going to give some light pressure on this. And now, in order to make use of the fin guide that the instructions show, you need to catch things before the fins have completely dried, so that if there is a problem, you can still pull that off without ripping it. But at the same time, you got to be careful that you don't offset one of the other fins while you're putting the next one on. Okay, so there's a little bit of a judgment call, and it's part of the reason why you don't want to do this as your first rocket. So I'm going to just set this up here for just a moment. And then I'm going to prepare the second fin, same way I did this. And then once that's on, we'll do the third fin. Again, putting the fins on is going to be pretty much the same, so I'm just going to stop this here, put the other two fins on, and come back and we'll look at how close I got it to what the fin guide shows in the instructions. So here's the view looking down on the rocket on top of the fin guide. And it looks like it's pretty close. Close enough that I really don't want to mess with it anymore and run the risk of making it worse again. So I'm going to go ahead and let this dry. I'm actually, as we're doing this, we'll go ahead and put the launch lug on as well. It can be drying at the same time the fins are. And so all we have to do with it here is cut it in two. Alright, so this is actually just 2 inches long. So I'm going to make a mark here. just cut through that. Alright, so now I have two smaller launch lugs. One of these is going to go right at the base, in between the fins, and then the second one will be located approximately 12 inches from the base. Okay, so we're going to have one right down here, and then the other one will be up at approximately this level. I'll go ahead and measure it out. And we'll put these on pretty much the same way we did with the fins. So I'm going to put a bead of glue along the bottom, and then let that get just a little bit tacky, and then stick it on. And then I'm going to let this dry again overnight. The glue is dry now, and the fins are still nice and straight. I rechecked them on the fin alignment guide here. Our next step is to put in some glue fillets, which will help strengthen the fins as they attach here, and it also kind of breaks up this perpendicular edge here where the fin meets the body tube and provides better aerodynamics that way. Again, you can use either white glue or wood glue for this step. I'm going to use the wood glue because it does set up a bit quicker. And you want to be careful you don't get too much glue here. Alright, this initial amount that I'm putting on is actually way too much. But what I'm going to do now is take my finger and smooth this out like this. And then I can use that excess to start the next one here. And the problem is, if you leave too much on here, it's going to flow as it dries, and you'll end up with knobs of glue or fillets that are thicker at one end or the other. And we don't want that. Now, if you want an even rounder fillet, you can use some wood filler on this, and I'm going to show you how to do that after the glue dries here. But I'm going to go ahead and finish this off here on this fin, and the other fins are going to be just like it. It's just, I don't think you need to watch me do all three of them. Okay, and then the thing is here is when you let this dry, let it dry level. Don't stand it up on its end, or the glue will tend to flow to one end or the other. And we'll come back again when the glue is dry and show you an optional way to increase the mass of the fillets here. I've got the fillets on the fins now, and they're still drying. At the same time, we can also put fillets on the launch lugs in the same way. And these often get overlooked. The launch lugs normally don't have to support a lot of weight, but if you've got a rocket out on the launch pad and you get a good wind come up, then the rocket kind of acts like a sail, and all of that force of the wind gets transmitted to the launch lugs. And I've actually had rockets break off from their launch lugs just with a good stiff breeze. And so you always want to make sure these are really well reinforced. You want to be careful not to get any glue up inside the launch lug, and I may have got just on the edge there. You can clean that out with a Q-tip or with a small piece of tissue. And the excess glue here on the body tube, you can squeegee away with a clean finger, and then a little bit of light sanding will take care of the rest of that. Okay? And sometimes you'll want to do more than one fillet coat here, where the glue may shrink away from the edges. You want to reinforce that again. So my fillets are set, although they're not completely dry yet. I don't need to worry about them running at this point. And so as they continue to dry, the next thing I'm going to do is put on the motor mount. And we've got the motor tube here, but now I need to put on the retainer. And that's this part here. Two-part gray pieces. And this inner threaded part is going to go on here. Okay, and if we made our measurements right, it should be flush on the inside here. So there's a lip here on the inside. That should be able to butt right up against the motor mount tube without quite hitting the centering ring here. Can't quite see that. Can't get it close enough. Alright, but the centering ring that's just inside the main body tube here. Okay, and we can use this spacer again to check it. So this would be the size of a black powder E engine. And you should have enough room, oops, that one turn of this at least should be possible. So I'm just going to actually do it this way. I'll turn it there and then slide it on. Okay. And so we should be able to do that without having the inside part of this move. So now if I take that out, put this back on again. Okay, so we've got the lip there. Pull this out, put that in. Okay, and you really can't see it here, but if you're looking at the base of this and where it sits on the motor mount tube, that should stay the same. Okay. Now, if you end up with the engine block in here just a little bit too far to the aft, and this sticks out too much, you can make up a little bit of that. Okay, so it should stick out past here a little bit, but not much. Okay, and so you may have the case where when we glue this in, you may have to make it so that the engine mount tube does not quite hit the lip here. And you can get maybe 2 millimeters on that. You don't want to do much more. If you've got too much space here and not enough gluing space on there, then this will become weak, and when the motor ejection charge goes off, this whole thing will come flying out. We don't want that. Okay. About the only thing you can do if your motor does not go in far enough is, one, limit yourself to smaller motors, which you probably don't want to do, because that's where we got the kit. But you could also go in here and very carefully and very tediously take a razor knife and slowly just cut out the engine block and then mount a new one further up into the motor mount tube. Now, one of the nice options about using this type of a motor mount, though, is that you can also use composite engines in there. And they can be either single use, or this one's a reloadable. But in general, these tend to be shorter than the black powder engines and have as much or more power. So for example, the reload kits for this one, and this is an Aerotech 2440, have both E and F power engines that fit in the same casing. And the way this one works is that instead of resting up against the engine block like the black powder engines do, this just slides in, and the base of the motor itself becomes the retainer, and that prevents it from going any further forward. And then with the cap in place here, and it doesn't want to turn while I don't have it glued, so if we put the cap in place here, okay, it can't come out backward either. And so when this is actually all mounted in place, it's a very, very secure motor mount, at least as secure as having the engine block in the old style clips, and these definitely last longer. Okay. Now, the tricky part here is that you have to use epoxy to glue these mounts in. Regular white glue or wood glue will not do it, as it simply won't stick to the plastic. And I wouldn't even trust the gel super glue to this. This needs to be really strong and really heat resistant. So a good epoxy will fill that role. You can get actual heat resistant epoxies, which you tend to see more in high power rocketry. This one General purpose epoxy works just fine. I've got a similar motor mount on 2 other rockets. I just use general purpose epoxy. I've never had a problem with it. Bigger motors, though, do get hotter and may reach the point where you melt the epoxy. Now, epoxy comes in several types, mainly depending on how quickly you have to get them in and working. So this type has a 5-minute working time, so from the point you mix it up to the point you get it set where you want it, you've got about 5 minutes before it starts setting up. And this particular one, when it says 5 minutes, it means it. It doesn't give you a nice slow set. You hit 5 minutes and suddenly it gels really quickly. If you want a little bit more working time, we have a 15-minute epoxy here. You can find different formulations up to about a 30 or 60 minute. Those are usually used for filling rather than gluing. I'm going to use the 15-minute epoxy on this one because what I'm going to do is actually make a little bit of excess so that not only will I glue my retainer here, I want a full film of epoxy around the base of this to provide more strength on the centering rings, and it just gives it a nice finished look too. Now, whichever epoxy you use, check the directions before you do anything and make sure that you mix it in the proper way. Now, most household epoxies are meant to be mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio by volume, and so usually it's a matter of estimating how much resin and how much hardener you need to put in there to get equal amounts. When working with small amounts like this, I found you can do it by weight just as well, and you can be more exact about it. Now, that in doing so, that assumes that the densities of these two are approximately equal. And as I said, if you're using small volumes, it doesn't seem to make any difference. It works just fine. There are some epoxies out there where you may only have, say, a 10-to-1 ratio that you don't use as much hardener with. So make sure you check your epoxy and mix it up the way you need to. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, lost my balance there. I'm going to go ahead and measure out a few grams of each. And that should fill up this little container. I highly recommend getting some sort of disposable containers for mixing epoxy in. It could just be a small paper cup. For larger amounts, I've used recycled yogurt cups. This is actually a little weighing dish that's meant to be used with this type of a balance. But once this epoxy hardens, you can't clean it out or anything. Oh, that's a little bit too much. Now, if you're going to have to be using this where you actually get it on your hands, be sure to wear rubber gloves because epoxy can develop allergic reactions with repeated exposure. And it's approximately equal there. Okay. And so I'm actually, since I've got this measured out, I'm going to go ahead and change into rubber gloves here, just in case, and then we'll come back and do the mixing. So now I've got my gloves, and it's a good idea, if you're going to err on the side of too much epoxy rather than enough, because if you've got too much, you can just throw away the excess or just find something around the house that needs to be put back together. But if you run short, then you run into the problem of one layer of epoxy being partially hardened when you got another layer trying to come on, and you may not get a good bond. And as I said, in my personal rocket here, I actually want a little bit excess so that I can flow it down around the motor mount and the centering ring. That just gives a nice smooth and strong finish to that end of the rocket. Now, it is possible to wait on doing this until after you paint the rocket. If you do it before, like I'm doing, just when you go to paint your rocket, make sure you mask off the threads really well and just leave off the actual retainer ring. Alright, so we want to get this to a nice uniform mixture, which is about there. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my rocket instructions so I don't ruin my cutting mat here. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is first place glue around, or the epoxy around the inside of this, and then I'll do the edges up here last to put the motor mount on. Now the thing you got to be careful is you don't want to get a bunch of excess epoxy up in here, because you don't want any extra thickness on the inside of this. So it's a good idea to use a very thin film of epoxy all the way around, and then put this on and just give it a little twist back and forth to seat it well. Now if this works right, I can lift up this camera. Alright, you'll get to see how messy my work area is. Alright, but now we can see in there. Let's see how good I am at maintaining everything. Okay, so you could use a popsicle stick or a tongue depressor for this as well. This 15-minute epoxy, though, has got a bit more flowability to it than others, which is good. And I've got to be really careful here. You might even consider taking a little bit of tissue paper and plugging the engine mount tube with that, and maybe a little layer of masking tape. So I don't want to get any of this down inside the tube, and it's just so narrow that I have to live a little bit dangerously here. Again, you don't need to do this part. Like I said, I'm just doing this to flow some in all along the centering ring there. For the actual engine retainer, it takes much less epoxy than this. But the nice thing is, even if I don't get it even on my first pass here, it will all flow nicely into all the corners. Now I do have to be careful that I don't get this too deep, because I don't want it creeping up on the threads either. Alright, so put that down. Look here. Okay, so it's almost everywhere I want it. Kind of dab along in there. Help it in. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do, and this is again optional, I'm just going to make a small thin layer here all along the inside. And this just strengthens the cardboard a little bit. It also makes it a little more flame and heat resistant so that it doesn't get as damaged from the exhaust gases. There's always going to be a little bit. Okay, and now I'm going to make my film on the outside of the motor tube. Okay. And get just a little bit more there. And again, I'm only applying this to the motor tube, not to the inner ring, because this way any excess will get forced down and out instead of up into the retaining part. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to take this, and at this point you got to make sure that everything's where you want it, because you can't go back very easily. Alright, so I've got that on there. Just a little tiny amount squeezing through, that's just about perfect. Alright, and the epoxy that I put on the base is just touching the tops of this. So that's That'll help bond it in there too. I'm just going to twist this back and forth a little bit to uniformly spread the epoxy. Okay. And now I just need to wait for a little while. So this will harden up in about 15 minutes or so. I'm going to let it go for a good 30 or more before we do anything else here, including test fitting. Although at this point, if things aren't fitting by this point, you've pretty much got to start over with it. Alright, so we're back again here, and our epoxy has completely hardened, and we've got a nice even layer up against that centering ring, as well as holding this very firmly in place. And so now we can put the retainer ring back on here, make sure it's fitting okay. Yep. And then we can also do this with our dummy engine here. Okay, and at least I want to be able to get at least one turn out of that to hold it in there well, and that works fine. If you're using composite engines, this will actually turn down even further because the lip of the composite engine will be right up against this. Alright, now I mentioned earlier that we could add some material to the fillets here, and to do that I'm going to use this plastic wood. This goes by a couple of different brand names. DAP makes this one, there's some others out there. But these are both water soluble and non-toxic. You can even use this in a watered down form as a sanding sealer. So if you mix this about 1-to-1 with water and make it into about the consistency of latex paint, you can actually use that to fill in gaps and cracks and such on the balsa fins in place of the urethane-based one that I used. Okay, but today we're going to use this full strength, and we'll use that to further fill in our fillets here to give more of a rounded edge to the bases of our fins. So to add the wood filler, you can either use the squeeze tube type here, and you can almost use this like you would glue. You can just snip off the tip here, a little bit of an angle, and then you could apply that directly to the fins. This one I've never opened, and I don't want to do that yet, so I'm going to use this, which I've been using already. And gloves really aren't needed for this. There's no safety hazard here. It's just I find it's really hard to get this stuff out from under my fingernails. And if you're going to use it in the paste form right out of the bucket like this, I just take some on a finger and then start at one end and just ease that in. It takes a little practice to get your finger placed just right. Okay. And you can always overcoat this, so I'm going to actually add a little bit more here. Now the advantage, if you just use a bare finger, it's usually going to come out a bit smoother. The wrinkles in the rubber of my gloves here are causing a little bit of irregularity. But even that you can overcome with a little bit of practice. And this stuff sands off really quickly. So if you've got too much somewhere, it will come back off fairly easily. Now keep in mind, this is just for aerodynamics. This stuff is not very strong, and so you don't want to rely on this to strengthen the fins. Use a glue fillet for that. Okay, but I'm just going to keep doing this as I go around the rocket and come back when I've got all three fins and the launch lugs done. So here's the somewhat finished result. This has just got the filler applied to it. It still needs to dry. According to the directions, it should dry for a few hours. I like to let this stuff dry completely overnight. And you can see it looks kind of globby and there's bits and pieces everywhere. I've really kind of overdone the launch lugs, and I did that intentionally so that when I sand this down, the launch lug will look almost integral to the tube that way. Okay, and so it may look rough right now, but all this stuff will sand down really easily. The little bits and pieces here that stick out will just break off once it's dry. And that's why I said this is not a strengthening type of finish. This is just going to be for aerodynamics and for aesthetics, because this stuff is not strong at all. And it's a good idea that just as soon as you've got this sanded, go ahead and put some primer on it to stabilize it. Okay, we're going to come back here next and start looking at the final assembly of some of these other parts. We're actually almost ready to paint. So one of the things we've put off until now is assembly of the parachute. And with most Estes kits anymore, the parachute's pre-assembled. You don't have to worry about attaching the shroud lines or anything. You just need to make sure they're all untangled and of equal length. And so the way we're going to do that is simply first to gather up all the loops here, like this. And then I'll hold the parachute at its middle here in the very center of it. And then by just pulling on that, that will give me equal length shroud lines. And I'm just going to make a loop here. And according to the instructions, the way they have you do it is to pass this loop through the eye of the nose cone here. And I'm always keeping at least one finger's grip on these shroud lines so that they don't move in their length. And then you can either take the parachute here, and now I do have to let go of the guy line or the shroud lines, which is why I don't like to do this. But you can pass this through here, okay, and just tighten down on it, and that will lock it into the eyelet there. The other way you can do it is to make your loop and then pass the nose cone through it. Either one will result in a looped knot through here. All right. Now, personally, I don't like to mount parachutes permanently because I may change them depending on how windy the conditions are, or whether in some rockets I'm carrying a payload or not. And just sometimes I want to be able to switch a parachute from one kit to another. And so here what I'm going to do instead is use a relatively large fishing snap swivel and attach that to these loops. I need a little knot out of there. There we go. So once again I'm going to find all of my loops here. I'm going to try and get those as untwisted and untangled as I can. If there's a little bit of overlapping and twisting, that's fine. It's really not going to hurt it. All right, but it just makes it easier. So here I've got, once again, recentered. Okay, and again I'm going to keep a hold of those lines so that they don't change in length. And now I'm going to take my snap swivel and I'm going to pass the shroud lines through the swivel side down here. And these come in lots of different sizes. What you want to do is use the smallest one that the snap will still fit over the nose cone eyelet. And these will, in general, for low and mid-power rockets, these are far and away strong enough to handle the loads that will be put on them. Okay, and so then once I got that through the eyelet, I just looped the entire snap swivel through it, and that's created a knot for me here. And I'm just kind of get all of the strings down on the same end. There we go. Okay, and then I can just tug on that so it's nice and tight. Okay, so now I've got my whole parachute here, and when I'm ready to fly, I can simply pop this through the eyelet here and then close it up. And this is what I mean about having this big enough. So this one is about as small as I can get and still enough room to reach around the eyelet here. Alright, and then the only other thing is the other end of the shock cord has to fit in here as well. Okay, so that's pretty much the parachute. And other than attaching the nose cone to the shock cord on the other section, right here. Okay, so when I'm all ready to go, I'll just go ahead and tie a double knot of my shock cord through the eyelet there. And then we still also have to glue this section into the base section. Okay, and to do that, just spread a film of glue all the way around the inside here, not on the coupler itself, and that way excess glue will get pushed toward the bottom and not up into the joint of the coupler here. But depending on how you want to paint this, you may or may not want to put this together quite yet. Okay, so if you're going to use one of the two schemes shown on the packaging, okay, so if we go back here, if you want to do the single color with the black nose cone there, go ahead and mount the two body tubes together and glue them before you do this. If you want to use the two color motif that they've got here, I would suggest not putting the tubes together until you've painted them, because the lower body tube here is going to be all black, and then the upper body tube has this more complex black over yellow, and then the nose cone as well. Okay. So if you want to do this one, I would keep these three parts separate. Don't worry about connecting this yet. So you go ahead and spray paint the nose cone first, and then that can be set aside once it's done. And then if you're going to use a two-tone motif here, then go ahead and spray paint the body the one color and the upper body another color, and then assemble everything once you have your paint the way you want it. Okay, so the last thing we'll do here in this video is to sand down our fillets here again. I am not going to go into painting of this since it's just too hard to do on camera like this one. It's just me here. Apogee Components actually has a really good series of videos on painting rockets, and I would highly recommend them if you need some help with your painting.